Nepal plunged in just 3 days into a crisis that feels like a nightmare. A nationwide curfew, army tanks patrolling Kathmandu, government buildings burned, the airport closed and then hurriedly reopened, and a toll of fatalities already ranging between 30 and 34. Hundreds of wounded overflow hospitals, while more than 15,000 inmates escaped amid the chaos. It all began with a government decision to block 26 social networks, but what looked like an administrative measure became the spark for a powder keg that was ready to explode. On September 9th, pressured by street violence and public anger, Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli resigned. Invited by the president to head a transitional government, he simply vanished, leaving the country in an unprecedented power vacuum. On September 11th, Kathmandu woke up to a tense calm. Soldiers on every corner, a curfew in force, and the sense that civilian life had been put on hold. The international airport, closed for 2 days, was reopened, not as a sign of normality, but as an escape route. Entire families packed flights to New Delhi to flee the violence, while schools and universities remained closed. The shutdown of digital platforms was the trigger, but not the real cause. The true fuel of this uprising is the accumulated frustration with entrenched corruption, stark inequality, and youth unemployment above 20%. For an entire generation that sees social networks as its voice and identity, the ban was read as censorship. When the government backtracked and tried to restore access, it was already too late. The movement had its own symbols, like the Straw Hat Pirates flag from One Piece, raised as an icon of defiance. The peak of violence came when politicians' homes were attacked, and the wife of a former prime minister lost her life in a brutal attack, turning protest into a moral reckoning against the entire elite. Nepal now lives a decisive chapter, where the army is not only a force of containment, but an arbiter of the political future. And it is about this power vacuum and the possible paths for the country that we will talk. Before we proceed, drop your view. Is blocking social networks a legitimate security measure, or just gasoline thrown on the fire of a revolt? The spark that ignited Nepal's crisis was the government's decision to block 26 social networks nationwide. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp and other platforms were shut off under the official justification that companies had not registered under new state regulations. For Nepali youth, this wasn't just a connectivity issue, but a direct attack on freedom of expression. Within hours, protests spread through the streets of Kathmandu and other cities, turning digital frustration into real-world mobilization. But the block was only the last drop in an ocean of discontent. The engine of the revolt runs much deeper. The country faces systemic corruption, visible in the contrast between the luxury lifestyles of politicians and their families, nicknamed Nepo kids, and the reality of millions of Nepalis who struggle daily with poverty. Videos and images of these youths flaunting luxury cars, international trips and exclusive parties went viral on the very same networks, feeding collective anger. Young people also face a lack of opportunities. Unemployment among those aged 15 to 24 had already surpassed 20% in 2024, forcing thousands to leave the country in search of work. In the last fiscal year, almost 840,000 permits for overseas employment were issued, a huge number for a country of 30 million inhabitants. Remittances from these workers prop up the economy and account for about 1/3 of GDP, but they do not offer prospects for the future inside Nepal. This external dependence only strengthens the feeling that the political elite doesn't invest in real solutions for the youth. When the government tried to reverse the social network block on the night of September 8th, hoping to calm protests, reality was different. The movement had already taken on a life of its own, with symbols and identity. Young people marched with Straw Hat Pirates flags from One Piece, turning the rebellion into a hybrid of global pop culture and local politics. That mix showed this wasn't just about censorship. It was the cry of an entire generation against decades of inequality, corruption, and stagnation. The block was the trigger, but the powder had been piling up for years. The government's response wasn't dialogue, but force. Security units were sent into the streets with clear orders to contain the crowds at any cost. Gas, rubber rounds, and live ammunition were used against demonstrators who defied the curfew. Images showed youths running through smoke, makeshift barricades burning, and direct clashes with armed police. The toll began to climb quickly, with sources ranging between 19 and 34 fatalities, plus hundreds of wounded, a snapshot of how hard it was to consolidate data amid chaos. Each attempt to suffocate the revolt only made it grow. When police closed avenues, protesters set public buildings on fire in response. Parliament, the Supreme Court, and even the presidential offices were invaded and attacked. Flames consumed symbols of state power, sending a clear message that the public no longer recognized institutional legitimacy. The target wasn't limited to official buildings. Politicians' residences were also invaded and set ablaze, turning collective fury into a kind of popular trial against the elite. The most striking and somber episode of this escalation was the death of Rajyalakshmi Chitraka, the wife of a former prime minister who perished in her own home. The crime shocked the country and symbolized how far the indignation had gone. It was no longer only a political protest. It had become the embodiment of visceral anger against those seen as privileged and untouchable. For many youths, targeting elite figures seemed the only way to expose a system that had ignored their voices for decades. Meanwhile, prisons in several regions were attacked and taken over by protesters. Gates were smashed, guards overpowered, and thousands of inmates released. More than 15,000 prisoners escaped in 2 days, creating a scenario of complete internal security collapse. Streets already in convulsion became even more dangerous with criminals at large, and the central government showed total inability to control events. At that point, the crisis ceased to be merely political and turned into social breakdown, where the line between protest and anarchy nearly disappeared. With Oli's resignation and the advance of chaos, Nepal fell into a power vacuum that opened space for a new protagonist, the army. On September 10th, the armed forces officially assumed control of security, imposing a nationwide curfew and deploying heavy patrols across Kathmandu and other cities. Heavily armed soldiers occupied intersections, blocked avenues, and cordoned off strategic buildings. The message was clear. If the civilian government failed to control the crisis, the military would become guardians of order. But the military's intervention also exposed the collapse of civilian institutions. The inability of parliament, the police, and even the presidency to contain instability turned the army into a political arbiter, a historically delicate role in Nepal. While the population saw soldiers as the only barrier against total collapse, fears grew that the military would not easily return power to civilians. Kathmandu's international airport, closed for 2 days due to smoke from burning tires and protests, was reopened on the afternoon of September 10th. What should have been a sign of normalization became the opposite. Long lines of people trying to leave the country, desperate tourists, entire families carrying improvised luggage. Indian carriers like Air India and Indigo increased flights to New Delhi, turning the airport into a portrait of mass exodus. Meanwhile, schools and universities stayed shut, reinforcing the sense that civilian life was fully suspended. At the center of this chessboard, President Ramchandra Paudel tried to stitch together a political solution. Talks began to surface about forming an interim government capable of restoring some trust. But the absence of Oli, missing since his resignation, symbolized the paralysis of the old political elite. With no visible leadership, no public confidence, and the army setting the pace, Nepal seemed headed for an uncertain transition, where the line between temporary containment and a de facto military government grew thinner. Drop a comment. Do you think the army should take command in moments of crisis, or does that always open the door to dangerous authoritarianism? Amid the desperate search for stability, an unexpected name emerged as a possible bridge for transition. Sushila Karki, former Chief Justice and the first woman to hold that post in Nepal's history. Proposed by protest leaders, the idea of appointing her as interim Prime Minister quickly gained traction precisely because she represents something distinct from the traditional political elite. Karki accepted the proposal, a symbolic gesture that lit a spark of hope in the midst of chaos. Choosing a former judge also carries strategic weight. While traditional politicians were discredited, and Oli himself had vanished from the public scene, Karki symbolized integrity and independence in a country marked by corruption. For the young people leading the protests, her acceptance felt like a win against a system that had always ignored them. But the challenge goes far beyond a new name in office. The transition depends on the ability to bring together civilian, military, and protest forces around a cohesive government, extremely difficult in a polarized, unstable environment. The army, now at the center of the board, will have to decide whether to genuinely support civilian leadership or keep prolonged control over the country. Meanwhile, the population continues under curfew, and the prison system has collapsed after the escape of more than 15,000 inmates. Insecurity grows, and fear of new clashes hangs over Kathmandu's streets. Kaki's appointment may be a historic step, but it will only become real if she can negotiate with generals, win public backing, and above all, offer a vision capable of restoring the trust of a traumatized nation. Nepal's crisis did not go unnoticed by the international community. Shortly after the first clashes, the UN condemned excessive force and called for independent investigations into the deaths. Antonio Guterres and Volker Turk issued public statements urging restraint and immediate dialogue. It was a clear message that the world was watching. India, a strategic neighbor with major influence, reacted quickly. Narendra Modi expressed sorrow for the victims and called for peace, but also took practical steps. Indian Airlines boosted flights to Kathmandu, helping evacuate tourists and Nepali citizens seeking to leave. The humanitarian gesture reinforced India's presence in the crisis, making it clear New Delhi wouldn't stay neutral as its neighbor unraveled. China took a different tone, more reserved and diplomatic. Its foreign ministry described Nepal as a traditional friendly neighbor and urged that problems be resolved internally, without external interference. The implicit message was clear. Beijing wants regional stability and does not intend to let Himalayan turbulence threaten its interests. From the United States, the reaction was indirect. There were no specific statements about the September crisis, but a policy announced months earlier by Secretary of State Marco Rubio resurfaced: visa restrictions for officials linked to digital censorship. Since the Nepal crisis began with a social network block, analysts suggested Washington could use this policy as a tool of diplomatic pressure. These varied responses reveal Nepal's delicate position, wedged between two regional powers, India and China, under the distant gaze of the United States and the UN. The geopolitical contest around the crisis is a reminder that even in a small country, local instability can quickly become a global concern. Nepal now walks a fine line between reconstruction and prolonged breakdown. Sushila Kaki's acceptance to serve as interim prime minister could be a historic milestone, but it remains to be seen whether she will have real conditions to govern a traumatized nation under the army's shadow. The curfew remains in force. Thousands of inmates are still at large, and the public lives with fear, distrust, and a sense that civilian institutions have lost credibility. The immediate task is to restore order, recapture fugitives, reopen schools and hospitals, and give people a minimal sense of safety. But the deeper problem lies at the root: inequality, corruption, and youth unemployment that fueled the fury. Without tackling these structural causes, any interim government will be just a patch on a powder keg ready to blow again. Nepal is not an isolated case. What we saw there has already happened in countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, a connected generation without prospects turning digital frustration into street revolt. Social networks have ceased to be mere communication tools to become political weapons capable of toppling governments in a matter of days. This is the new pattern of 21st century instability, and the question is inevitable. Could what started in Nepal repeat elsewhere? Do you believe a simple social network block can trigger an upheaval in countries living under the same explosive mix of corruption, inequality, and hopelessness? Share your view below, because what is happening in Nepal is more than a local crisis. It's a global warning.